Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalat, wassalam ala rasulillah. Welcome everybody to the first in a series of webinars by the Islamic Seminary of America. In this case, it's co-sponsored by the Association of Muslim Chaplains, the Council on American Islamic Relations, Islamic Horizons Magazine, Muslim Endorsement Council, and us, the Islamic Seminary of America. My name is Jimmy E. Jones. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Islamic Seminary of America. And let me just give you an overview in a moment after one of our panelists, Chaplain Imam Omer Bajwa, gives us an opening dua.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. All praise belongs to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and blessings and salutations on the noblest of prophets and messengers, our leader, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on his family and on his companions. We pray to Allah that He blesses this endeavor, that He blesses our teachers, and allows us to engage in the best of ways to discuss the beauty of our deen and to share it with others. Ameen.
Ameen. So what you have before you is a webinar that's organized by the Islamic Seminary of America, which is part of the Islamic Seminary Foundation that started about a decade ago in what's known as the Shura Conference at Yale University. Our panelists tonight are Attorney Roulla Alouch, who's the board chair of CARE National, Chaplain Omer Bajwa from Yale University, whom you just heard, and myself, the Executive Vice President of the Islamic Seminary of America. How we're going to proceed tonight, we have basically three parts. First, I'll try to set a framing of the discussion of race and the future of Muslim American leadership. Then we'll have a discussion between myself and the panelists. And then what we'll do is we'll go to you. We have 2 or 3 tech people. We'll take your questions and we'll try to have a conversation at the very end. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So what we'll try to do is, with this PowerPoint, try to frame how we're talking about this. Because one of the things that the Islamic Seminary of America is trying to do is reframe how we talk about religion, how we talk about Islam in this particular country. Reframe it, because much of the talk about religion and Islam in this country at this particular point is extremely, extremely negative. And oftentimes, Islam is used as a sort of battering ram for making religion seem negative. So it's an idea of changing that narrative and bringing us together in a way that we become the moral leaders of not only this country, but the world. So in framing this, race and the future of Muslim American leadership, I'd like to suggest that there are 3 points to open this discussion about this, what's called the United States racialized context. What I mean by racialized is that we, in this country, we think and act a lot in relationship to the concept of race as we understand it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So when we talk about race and the future of Muslim American leadership, we must understand that the United States is a racialized and, by the way, gendered context where how you're perceived in terms of your race, to a large extent, determines how you're treated in that context. And so if we're going to talk about race and the future of the Muslim American leadership, we have to begin by looking at the context out of which we operate. And I want to frame it in 3 points. In the United States, racism is real, but race is not. The second point is we in the United States have race. We love race, but are loath to talk authentically or authentically engage one another about the concept of race. And third, Muhammad ﷺ's multicultural community model should provide instructive principles for Muslim American leadership today. So if we look quickly at these 3 concepts, the idea that US racism is real but race is not, I offer another 3 points for each point. We start with the Quran, which is the basis of knowledge for us, and Surah and Nisa, the first ayah. Many of you know it better than I do. Yeah, ayyuhan nas, O humanity, fear your God and Lord, who has created you from one person, and from this one person created his mate. So from the Islamic perspective, we all are descended from one being. From the Islamic perspective, we're all descended from one being. And so in that sense, there's no such thing as, this black race, the Arab race, the white race, because we all come from one being. And so the second point about that is, so therefore race is a biological fiction. This is discussed in a book. I love books, I teach. So a book called Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigration and the Alchemy of Race by Matthew Fry Jacobson, which was published in 1999. He says race is a biological fiction. The point here is that race has no basis in biology, in the sense that we often think of race as an essential idea, and that somehow that if we drew blood and looked at people's DNA, we could tell what race they are. And there's ample evidence to the contrary, because the reality is that we're all descended from one being, and the most racial diversity, the biological diversity when it comes to race, is on the continent of Africa, where biologists and anthropologists believe that all human beings came from. So it's a biological fiction, it's not real. But again, racism is real, but race is not. And the third point is, since this is Black History Month, is one of the reasons we're having this, is that I'm one of the people who think we need Black History Month and Women's History Month, because women and Black people and other people, it's not just them, we have Latino Heritage Month, have been marginalized in society. And every once in a while, on a regular basis, I think we need to be reminded of that marginalization, because I know there's a lot of debate about this. So if we look at Black morbidity, that the rate of death of Black people, and there's a lot of data about this, but I chose to look at Black morbidity for Black women who are pregnant, is that a Black woman going into a hospital, even if she has higher education and higher economic status, is more likely to die, right, as a result of childbirth, which is not a disease, by the way, than any other group in the United States of America. And I would argue that this is because of racism and implicit bias, and we could talk about that later on. All right, that's the first point. I don't want to talk the whole time. Let's speed up a little bit. So we in the United States love the concept of race, but loathe or hate to talk authentically. In other words, really talk from how we feel and engage with one another about it. Again, Quran is the basis of knowledge, and we know 49:13 very well, where Allah tells us the meaning of which that we created races and tribes as a test for us. The second point is that Americans are infatuated. We really love this idea of race. It surrounds us. We think about it all the time. We build programs around it, and people even run for president on the basis of talking about different races in America. And this is a point I made in Islamic Horizons magazine article, which some of you read before this webinar. The third point under we in the United States love race but are loath to talk about it is that we're loath to talk to one another about race. And this is from a book which I would recommend called Racial Healing by a friend of mine named Harlan Dalton, who's an Episcopal priest and also faculty emeritus at Yale Law School, where he talks about how much we don't like to talk about race, and he offers some pointers for talking about it. Okay, the third point. So our beloved Muhammad wasalam's multicultural community model should provide instructive principles for Muslim American leadership today, particularly around this issue of race. And generally, it should be instructive to us, but particularly around this issue of race. And if we look at Quran 5:8 and the sense of this ayah, is that the point I wanted to make here is that this ayah says, never let the people, part of it says, never let the enmity towards you cause you to swerve from justice. In other words, we shouldn't return hate with hate. It just multiplies hate. And this is a Quranic principle that we should not, because someone is unjust to us, we should not hate them. The second point, under our third point, is that rich and poor work together. This is a nice little volume that's published by my friends at IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, The Rich and Poor Work Together, in volume 1. And this is instructive in terms of Muhammad ﷺ, how he handled a multi-ethnic, multi-racial an ecumenical, if you will, community, because everybody wasn't Muslim in the Medina society. And this book is very instructive about this. And finally, prophetic meritocracy is the way to go. What pops into my mind is, since again it's Black History Month, is our beloved Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, who was the first mu'adhin and had other important roles in the early Muslim community. And Osama ibn Zayd, may Allah be pleased with him, who was relatively young, who was deputed by our beloved Prophet ﷺ to lead an army. And so prophetic meritocracy is part of what that's all about. And so I would like to close my comments by quoting our beloved Malcolm X, rahimahullah, who was martyred in this month, even Black History Month. He said in one of his speeches, this is excerpted from the book Malcolm X Speaks, selected speeches and statements by George Breitman in 1994. He says, one of the first things I think young people, especially nowadays, should learn is how to see for yourself and listen for yourself and think for yourself. This generation, especially of our people, has a burden, more so than any other time in history. The most important thing that we can learn to do today is think for ourselves. And see, since we're an educational institution, this is something that we emphasize. And so, as I said, we'll go from this and ask Attorney Alouch and Chaplain Bajwa to have a discussion with me about the whole issue of race and the future of Muslim American leadership. I'd like to begin that discussion by reminding us that this conversation will continue. The Islamic Seminary of America is joining with the Association of Muslim Chaplains and Muslim Endorsement Council. We actually are going to continue the discussion about this topic at the beginning of our 10th annual conference on March 21st. And during the summer, one of the courses that we'll be focusing on cross-cultural communication will be counseling cross-cultural communication, which will be in June the 5th. And of course, you can go to our website and see this thing. So that's the way I want to frame it. And so I'm going to invite Chaplain Omar and Attorney Roulla Alouch, who's the chair of CARE National, to join in the conversation and give their thoughts about what our role and responsibility as Muslims in terms of the whole issue of race in the American context. Which one of you wants to jump in now?
Go ahead, Roulla.
Thank you, Brother Omar. Jazakallah khair, and Jazakallah khair, Brother Jimmy, for setting the tone for our conversation. I just think it's important for us as Muslims in this country of all backgrounds, regardless of what our racial background is, to be mindful of the diversity in our community and the need to support one another and be true allies for one another. And speaking as an American-born daughter of immigrants from Syria, I think those of us, depending on where we come from in the community, may have unique roles and responsibilities. And so as being a member of the immigrant Arab community, I often think it's important to use my voice in places where perhaps people of other backgrounds and races aren't present, to make sure that I'm advocating for all of my brothers and sisters, and whether that be in interpersonal settings, social settings, but far more importantly, I think, is in the context of any leadership responsibilities or roles that we may find ourselves with, that we want to ensure that, I think it's an amana, that we have a responsibility and a trust from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ensure that we are using those roles in a way that's for the good of everyone in our community.
I mean, I would second everything that Sister Roulla said.
Go ahead, Omar.
No, I would second everything that Sister Roulla said. I think that, like you said it beautifully, that we have a responsibility both in our interpersonal lives, in that, I'm of South Asian heritage, and obviously all of us inhabit our own spaces within our sub-communities, and that we see things that are unfortunately detestable. We've probably seen or heard things in our communities where people have gotten away with, and I think it's that those are the moments of courage that we're called to as Muslims. to strive to speak the truth in the best of ways. And then also we work in our own professional spheres. And really it's that idea of stepping up as Muslims, regardless of seeing beyond race and culture and class, ethnicity, of standing for the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ and the values of Islam in our distinct professional settings.
So this is the broad responsibility we all have, but how do you think the concept of race impacts how Muslim Americans see the issue of leadership within our community? Either of you?
I'll address that to some degree, Brother Jimmy. I've seen, unfortunately, too many instances where, I don't know, I get the sense that people in leadership roles think, well, okay, if there's one person that's of a certain background or one woman in the room, then that means that person is present and can speak on behalf of all. And that's somehow sufficient, that if there's one person of a certain background, then that means, or one woman in the room, then that means that, you know, we've done our part. We're a diverse and inclusive group. And you know, I think that does a disservice to the community that we come from, that is such a beautiful mix of people from so many different backgrounds and perspectives. And the more that we can diversify, especially the leadership in national organizations, the more we'll be able to better advocate for and represent our community, because we'll be utilizing a diverse perspective of people from the broad range of our community members.
But isn't this easier said than done? There's a book that I use, and I teach a course called The Power of Prejudice by a guy named Gordon Allport, Allport. And he says in one of the chapters in the book, foreigners are a strain. And what he means by this is that everywhere in the world, he argues in the second chapter of the book, that everywhere in the world, people eat, mate, work with people who are like them, that speak the same language, that eat the same food, and that this is a matter of convenience, because foreigners are a strain means that if somebody speaks another language, it takes a greater effort to do so. And so let's be honest, are we swimming upstream here when most of us, and maybe the two of you don't, when you go in the room, you look for people who are like you. That's the first thing that you do. And that's my question. Are we swimming upstream given our human inclination toward making it easy to be around people who are like us?
No, it's a great question. I mean, it's definitely a challenging question. Two thoughts that come to my mind are, let's just be honest and frank with each other, especially given the time limit, is that, a lot of our communities, especially that are immigrant majority masajid and sub-communities, definitely have their own racial prejudices and cultural biases on how they think who is leadership, who has the authority to speak on behalf of the community, on behalf of Islam, who has the authority to lead the community. And these are challenges that, in my lifetime, I've seen, for the last few decades. And these are people that are ignorant of the history of Islam in America. And we don't have time to unpack all of that right now. We need to name it. The other thing that I'll say to your question is that, I have the privilege of working with a lot of young people, with Muslim millennials and Muslims that are, part of Generation Z. And they're growing up in a very different climate, a very different cultural and political and social climate, where they can speak very intelligently and very fluently about issues of structural racism, about issues of the importance of diversity and equity and inclusivity in their classroom, in their workplaces, how they envision a sort of a new society. And I think in a beautiful way, that type of conversation is coming into our Muslim community spaces and needs to, in an increased way, into our masajid. That what does it look like to have an incredibly multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic Muslim community now, that's been there, but we're seeing more and more of now.
Yeah, I have two thoughts.
Back up against this idea of that, people are going to have less and less opportunities, perhaps, to retreat into that ethnic enclave where they have to contend with diverse communities.
Yeah, I wish. I think it's true to a certain extent, because if you look at the data, you'll see that generally in the United States of America, there are more mixed race marriages and so-called mixed race marriages, and within the Muslim community, even though there's that bias. That's one thing. The second thing is that we often talk about the bias of the so-called immigrants, so when you stop being an immigrant, by the way, you know, people of third or fourth generation, but the so-called immigrant community and against the so-called Black community, because Black is really not a race. But there is I know for a fact that there's an anti-immigrant bias amongst many African-American Muslims as well. And I'm not saying it's equal, because often the so-called immigrants often have more power, but the reality, we need to own it. And if you're going to be authentic about it, as we talked about, we need to own the fact that it's a two-way street, that there's some biases from African Americans toward so-called immigrants, and that's where the talk should start. And the other thing I wanted to say, and I'll stop in response to you, is that you talk about structural racism. I like to bring up the point about the mortality rate of Black women, no matter what their education is. If you look at the data, education or economics, this is crazy in the United States of America, that if you're going to have a baby simply because you happen to be a Black woman, that your life is more in danger than others. That means that there are major structural problems, right? That I think that the two I would put together: structural problems coupled with implicit bias. You know, that is, there are numerous studies that show that still in modern medicine, people think that Black people can withstand more pain than white people, because this is something that grew up. So my point is that are we, and we're going to let we'd like to invite our viewers to, you know, post their questions. We're going to let you in a few minutes, but is this? I applaud your optimism, Omar. But given what we're seeing in the United States of America, is this an extreme uphill battle for us?
I think it is, Dr. Jones. That's the reality of our community and of our country. I think what is unique for Muslims, I find us with a unique opportunity to lead on this matter, that as a community and as a country, we need to start having dialogue with one another, be open and honest about the biases that are present. I mean, I oftentimes am still frustrated when people want to be defensive about the idea of having any kind of bias. That's fact, and science tells us that that's just the reality of human nature. But if we as a community can apply the teachings of the Quran and apply the teachings of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and be able to have the dialogue with one another, be open and honest, and, you know, really work on the challenges that we have as a community. It's hard, it's tough work, it's necessary, and I think we could be an example for the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I second that.
Yeah, that's easier said than done, right? Because our beloved Prophet was, you know, he's very special. I think that, for instance, if you, without going on and on about it, but if you look at him as a total package, right? He was our spiritual leader. He was a military leader. He was this Mecca, Medina, the hijra between Mecca and Medina, the hijra between Mecca and Medina was a brilliant example of merging two communities that were very different, right? One being an agricultural community, the other one being a more mercantile community. And so it was a brilliant example of that. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that he was a total package in a way that none of us can be. And so I think the point is that even at, I try to help us understand at the seminary that we try to teach our courses often having 2 or 3 people at the same time, simply because we're trying to get away from this idea that one person knows it all. And nobody, in my view, has the total package of our beloved Prophet ﷺ. And so therefore, the whole concept of shura becomes much more important, in that this is a fundamental point, that if we don't listen, the Prophet ﷺ was often called all ear. If we don't listen, we're not going to know what the various parts of our community even think at a particular time.
No, I mean, to that point, if I may, I absolutely hear where you're coming from, is that it's much easier said than done. But what I feel is that we're called to really engage authentically and honestly with the aspirational project. which is that I don't think Islam is presenting this utopic vision, or that Muslims need to be buying into this utopic vision of like a race blind or a color blind society. It's that we are dealing with structural racism, we're dealing with implicit bias, as was mentioned, like we're dealing with really serious problems at every level. But as Muslims, we're called to, like, you know, the high virtue ethics. Like, what can we do to really try to rectify and society and remedy these problems? And one other thing I want to add is that, from my understanding, from what I've learned from my teachers, is that one of the gems of the many gems that comes out of the CETA is that it really has to start at a local level, right? We have to hyper localize this kind of work. Like, within my immediate community, within my masjid, within my consortium of masajid, in the city that I inhabit, how can we really present a workable model that's going to take hard work, that then we can sort of share with the broader community?
Yeah, but there's something, and I'm not seeing the questions, and maybe the technical people can help me with this. This is my first time doing Zoom in this particular way. So, but the point here is that it seems to me it has to be a dual track thing. In other words, I don't, our beloved Prophet ﷺ, while he was nurturing the community in Mecca, right? He was also dealing with the Quraysh, right? He was also interfacing with them. He was also making da'wah with them, right? And so it really is not a thing where we can close ourselves off and says, well, we can just deal with our community. It is a parallel track thing. And I guess the point is that where I end up is that we're never going to be able to make change in the broader society until we make some fundamental change in how we function in our community and how we deal with people who are different in our community. And it's a two-tracked issue, because how can we say to other people that you should be anti-racist, you should treat women with justice, for instance, and we don't do it ourselves? There's nothing to follow that up, right?
Said it perfectly, Dr. Jones.
So if our beloved Prophet ﷺ is our moral exemplar, what are the things that when we look at our role in the broader society, because there's a lot going on around race in the broader society, what are the things that we should be trying to do as Muslims, particularly you're working in the college campus, Omar, and you're working as the head of one of the largest Muslim nonprofit advocacy agencies. What are the things that we should be doing?
One of the things that I'll just jump in right now that I'm personally very interested in, I want to learn more about, so I can't in any way speak as having an expertise on this, but there's a lot of fascinating work that's being done now about restorative justice and the power of restorative justice. And when we look at these really systemic problems and just these gross abuses that, you know, throughout society on issues of race and class, how can we as Muslims be in that conversation? Like, we need to data mine our own tradition, so to speak, on, you know, the Prophet gave us as you said, he was the exemplar. He gave us a beautiful model of a functioning society and functioning community. And so how can we look into that and pull out examples of restorative justice to, you know, for intra and inter-community work?
Talk a little bit more about what restorative justice is.
Restorative justice is that, I mean, one of my understandings of it is that, you know, if we live in a society that is so imbalanced in terms of how it polices and punishes people, and we have this carceral state, is that are there you know, mechanisms in which, when we have infractions, right, we have breaches of social order or breaches of communal standards, that how, without going into sort of into adjudication, or not criminal adjudication, and I realize I'm talking to Sister Roulla, who's an attorney, so I don't want to go outside my lane here, but are there ways that you can actually restore the tear in the fabric of that community, and it not have to go into a very legalistic paradigm, where there's healing taking place, and there's a sense of compassion and a sense of naming the wrong and the hurt that was done and acknowledging it, and a way of working towards restoring that dignity that was lost.
I'm just trying to figure out, I've talked to several people about this. How do you do this on a large scale basis when, let's switch back to our community. There's so many people who feel so hurt by the things our leaders say to them when they come, whether in the Islamic Center or Muslim space. How do we turn this around?
You know, I think part of it is each of us as members of the community taking ownership of the term leader and who we permit to operate with that term. There are many individuals who we've learned that, you know, self-identify as leaders, or they find themselves perhaps in leadership roles, but as a community and individuals within it, I think we need to take a more active role at all levels at Masajid, where if there's an opportunity to vote for leadership, an opportunity to run to serve in positions of leadership, that we are putting ourselves in those roles, in particular where we're mindful of the intra and interracial dynamics and challenges that happen within and, you know, within our community and then with our community and the outside, so that these perspectives of diversity, inclusivity, equity are addressed, and these individuals that are so-called leaders, they don't get to continue to operate with that title when they're not satisfying the Islamic obligations that come with that role.
Yeah. So this all sounds very good, right? Because we've actually we've talked about this before one-on-one. How do you, what kind of policies and procedures? Let's drill down a bit to the people. Some of the people listening out there is, okay, race and Muslim American leadership. Are there policies and procedures or specific things that people should do in organizations or chaplains should do? In your case, Chaplain Omar, are there things that you do within your organizations or individually in leadership that fight the racist paradigm that we see functioning in American society right now?
I mean, I can jump in real quickly, which are two things that come to mind. One is that, you know, I have professional training and I belong to a professional organization that has standards of codes and conduct, right? And when there's breaches of that, of ethical breaches or professional breaches of that, there's, you know, I have a supervisor that I answer to. I'm part of a structure that has checks and balances. That's number one. And I understand, like, within the Muslim community, that's difficult, right? You have but we somehow need to reimagine, you know, there's, you know, what's spoken about the tension between the imam and the board. And then, you know, one is trying to outmaneuver the other. But then how do we reimagine sort of distributing leadership roles and empowering the community in other ways, so we don't have like dictators for life? And we've all heard horror stories where you have one or two individuals that can hijack an institution and literally just dismantle it from the inside and drive people away. And these should be cautionary tales for us, is that whether it's money, whether it's charisma, whether it's, you know, political maneuvering that gets people into power and they hold on to power. I mean, these are like, we need to somehow break out of that paradigm.
Well, and to be the lawyer in the group, a lot of times our institutions don't have the proper organizational documents, the proper structures, the proper training of people serving in especially volunteer capacities as board members to ensure that we're, you know, setting term limits for board members, that there are those types of structures in place. And then also that the individuals that are serving in those capacities have an understanding of what their obligations are. And maybe more importantly, that the membership that those leaders are appointed to serve have an understanding of their power and their ability to say, if there's somebody who's either serving, you know, ongoing, the dictator type person that you're mentioning, Brother Omar, or if it's just somebody that's not fulfilling the desires of the populace. I mean, the feelings and sentiments of the membership of the Masajid, for example, or of the organizations or the community that organizations are serving, you know, really, I would hope would use their voices to speak the truth of what's happening and to ensure that, and to take those steps to try to remedy the challenges that you're talking about, Dr. Jones. It's not easy, and, you know, there's multiple parts that have to come into play. The attorney in me sees that our institutions, and especially our Masajid, could certainly use that type of knowledge and training and education.
Okay, we go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say when Sister Roulla was talking, one idea that that crossed my mind apropos to that is, and people like yourself and many others like Dr. Jackson have been talking about this for a while, is that unfortunately, while we have a very multiracial, multicultural society in the Muslim society in the U.S., we also, unfortunately, parts of our society lack basic Islamic literacy. And if we can increase the Islamic literacy and really a deeper appreciation, understanding for the Sira and how the early community was forged, right? And the trials and tribulations they went through and how the Prophet ﷺ led them, so that we know more as Muslims. So we're not susceptible to people manipulating our lack of knowledge and lack of awareness of Islam. That we as a community need to, we need to do a better job of educating ourselves about our own history.
This segues into a couple of questions we have. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for the important conversations. What are some practical tips you advise, Dr. Jones, for us to bridge the gap between so-called immigrant and African-American Muslims and communities in terms of being proactive, talking from your experience? This may sound too obvious. Let me talk about 3 A's. One is your primary relationship is with Allah, not with your people, right? Not with Black people, not whoever you are. I mean, this may sound too obvious, but for me, I try to make my primary relationship be with my Lord. I love my people. I love African Americans, don't get me wrong. But I try to make and to the extent that you make that your primary relationship, it's much more difficult for you to other or put down other people. And so this is something that starts with your basic character, right? And how you do yourself and what kind of tarbiyah that you have for yourself and for your family. This is critically important. This is not going to work, using our beloved Prophet ﷺ as a moral exemplar is not going to work if we don't do the spiritual work. And I know that this is so critically important, right? That work, if my primary relationship with Allah, and I spend some time with the Quran, and by the way, you do not have to be an alim to do this. My area is not Islamic studies. It's cross-cultural relations compared to religions. But I know many people like myself who try to spend some time with the Quran every day in English language, in Arabic, and to the extent, but if you spend more time catching up with the sports, then the sports will sort of be the basis for you. And I can't emphasize this enough. These are the kind of people we want in leadership, for whom their relationship with Allah is permanent. Then secondly, they affirm who they are, because this is society really makes Black and brown people feel like we're marginalized. If you're Black or you're brown, whether it's Mexican or Arab or African-American or Muslim, you're marginalized. And so I often say to people, never let people tell you not to be proud of being African-American or being Syrian or whatever you happen to be. I mean, and for me, loving Allah and focusing on Allah it's not contradictory. Because Allah Ta'ala tells us in Surah An-Nisa, right? Reverence the womb that bore you, right? And the reason that we do is that Allah Ta'ala tells us that we came from one person, and that, so we just have to be, like Malcolm says, we have to think for ourselves instead of buying into the paradigms that we have. The third thing is affirmative action. What do I mean by this? That if we live in a racialized and gendered society, then our lenses should be looking for this in our community. What I mean is, if you're in leadership in the community, you should be looking out for situations where people are either marginalizing, putting down, or excluding people based on their race, or marginalizing, putting down people, excluding people based on their gender. Our beloved Prophet, when people were trying to marginalize Bilal, we know, many of you know this, he stepped to it, because that's, to me, one of the responsibilities of those in leadership. We shouldn't shut up. We should say, look, you shouldn't be treating him or her this way because they're this or that. And so those are the 3 A's: your relationship with Allah, affirming who you are, and never let anybody put you down because of where you came from, and also having your own affirmative action program. And one more thing, and I will stop, and the two of you can add in response to this question, is that, for instance, I pray at Masjid al-Salam, where A lot of these ideas started, by the way, under Imam Zaid Shakir. And there was a halaqah that used to be held on Thursday nights. And everybody in the halaqah happened to be South Asian, right? A Quranic halaqah. And several of us says, look, we're not going to have this. First of all, we all need to learn Quran, right? And secondly, people are letting it be a South Asian thing, if you follow me. And so a number of us committed to doing it. This is what I call affirmative action. That's an example of it. The two of you want to add anything? I know I went on for a while.
You know, I just think of a nice story I have when you're talking about affirmative action, Dr. Jones. My parents immigrated to the US from Syria. They settled in a community that they're originally from Syria, and there were no other Syrians in the community. And they found themselves connecting with people of all different backgrounds. In more recent years, there were a large number of Syrians who located into the community my parents are in. And I would observe my mom specifically being challenged to sit with and hang out with her own, as you were referencing earlier, sit with the Syrians or exclusively almost be with that group. And I observed her and was really proud of her and learned from her how she navigated bringing the Syrians into the larger community and engaging with others, and not, you know, finding the comfort and the ease of, okay, these people grew up like me or from a community like mine, speak similar language. We're going to go sit over here and hang together alone, and instead brought them in. And now you have, you know, a community of women that are together from all different backgrounds. And that's, you know, I share that story because it's a positive one, but it also took some action. And I remember my mom telling me a few times that people would, especially the Syrian ladies, would give her a hard time. Why are you hanging out with them? Why aren't you sitting with us? Or why are you doing this? And now those same ladies are friends with the ones that she brought together. And, you know, it's a simple example of how, when you take the initiative, you can start to build those bridges.
Omar, you want to add anything to that?
I'm going to say thank you so much, Sister Roulla, for sharing that story. I mean, it's a quote unquote like everyday story, but it's very profound, and that's like everyday leadership, right? That's what it takes. You know, we can't wait for it to come from on high. It's that, you know, it has to be individuals that have you know, moments of moral courage, and that are just going to kind of get outside their comfort zone. So thank you. I think we need 1,000 times more stories like that in our own communities.
Yeah, the story just reminds me that I don't think it's anything wrong, and I don't think you were saying this, with people being with their own people. I like African Americans. I like watermelon and fried chicken. I know I'm being stereotypical. I really do. But I also like I also like naan, and I also like Pakistani food, right? I'm not that great on Syrian food. Sorry, Roulla. But right. My point is that many of the way we frame race, you know, in terms of black and white, the reality is, I was talking to one of my friends who's an imam. The reality is that even though a person may look like me, that person may have a different social cultural history than I do, right? They may be from Jamaica. They may be from Nigeria. They may be British, you follow me? And to assume that everybody with a black skin has the same, and I want to add this, I want to say this, has the same experience of being victimized in the United States is a mistake. You follow me? And so a lot of the times, we black folks, we get together and we just submerge everything under blackness, as if everybody who looks like me had great-grandparents who were slaves. It's simply just not true, right? But you can't say anything about it because the dominant narrative is that narrative. And I think we need to break that up. And it's also true for people who are Pakistani or Syrian. They don't come from the same place. They don't have the same experience. They're not socially, culturally the same. And so it's as if we can't think in very nuanced terms. And so my advice to, I might as well say it, my advice often to African-American students who are feeling victimized in the college setting, for instance, right? They often are asking for safe spaces. They're often asking for warnings about trigger words and that kind of thing. I said, whatever you do not image yourself as a victim. Image yourself as being of value of wherever you are. And so therefore, the reason why you want respect is not because I'm so thin-skinned that if you say something to me, I'm going to fall apart, right? The reason why you should respect me and you shouldn't say disrespectful things is because I'm a valued member of this community and you don't disrespect people. You see the tone, the different tone? Lots of times the tone is what I call the victim tone. Oh no, please don't say this kind of thing. Okay, the other question was, because we're running out of time, right? We have about 5 minutes, is what advice can you give the youth or young adults that want to bring more diverse programs and events to their community? Well, Chaplain Omar, you want to?
Sure. No, it's a great question. I would say I'll answer in two levels. One is if presuming you're part of a campus community and you're part of an MSA, I guess, and then if you're part of a larger community, a masjid or a community center, is that the first piece of advice I would give is to get involved. And I understand it's very easy to say that. It's very hard to do, especially if you feel that you're a minority within your community, racially or culturally. But that's where really, try to make try to build relationships with people within the community that will then help you, sort of be welcomed in. And my advice to if you're a part of the majority community, like hypothetically, that if you have a MSA that's majority South Asian or Arab, and you happen to be, a Black American Muslim that's in a minority, is that my advice to the leadership of whoever's in majority status is that they need to step up and wake up and realize, the problem. And recognize their blind spots on what voices are missing from the conversation and how do we invite those voices into the conversation. So is to then bring in like your ideas and say, it's great that, I think in terms of very practical on the ground stuff is that, does the MSA always have the same kind of food from the same caterer? How can we actually change the little things that actually mean something? Is the type of food you're having, the type of the speakers that you're inviting, the type of cultural programming that you're doing on your campus. That's number one. Number two is if you're part of a masjid, is that build a coalition of people across the community that say that, it's wonderful what's being done, but how can we add to that and supplement the kind of programming we're having with making it more inclusive, bringing in diverse perspectives. That are going to address our community.
We're about running out of time. Here's a question that I think we really should address. Assalamu alaikum. Don't we have to study clinically the psycho-spiritual damages caused by the Holocaust of enslavement and the colonization devastation, which is the roots of much of the internal struggle regarding racism, prejudice based on color, with Caucasians at the top? I've observed this in my own community, African Americans. I've seen it in the Arab and the South Asian community. Okay, woo, 3 minutes, right? Okay, all right, here's the point. I absolutely agree that we should study this and understand it, but not in isolation. During the 1920s, from the end of slavery up until the 1950s, over 4,000 Black people were lynched in the South. 4,000, subhanAllah. And if you look at the Equal Justice Initiative, some great work that Attorney Brian Stevenson has done in this particular regard. He's opened a museum about this. And I agree with the questioner that we should understand this. But we should understand it in concert with the eugenics movement, which many Black people know nothing about. They don't know anything about a Carrie S. Buck, who was a young woman from Charlottesville, Connecticut. I live in Connecticut now. Charlottesville, Virginia. I was living in Virginia. Charlottesville, Virginia. Who there's a 1927 court case called Buck versus Bell, right? And what that case held, basically Oliver Wendell Holmes, the liberals led this kind of eugenics movement. Was 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, and it allowed the state of Virginia to sterilize this particular young, poor white woman. What does this lead to? This led to the sterilization of 60,000 people in the United States, many of them Black and brown. And so this is another strand of the oppression that the questioner is talking about. We shouldn't be just looking at what was happening with Black people, because there were white people who were called imbeciles, who were institutionalized, who were sterilized at the same time that they were lynching us. And that we shouldn't act as if the only kind of oppression that's going on is that lynching. We should understand what's happening here, because for me, it's about that 1%, what we call the 1% now, controlling the rest of us. And let me just say, I think we should have Black Lives Matter movements. Absolutely. I think we should understand the psychology of enslavement, but it's within a larger social context, a social context where in the first immigration laws in this country were for white people. And they weren't just against people we call Black people. The Irish weren't white, right? The Jews weren't white. And so this is what I meant by quoting Malcolm X. The best thing we can learn to do is think for ourselves. And Malcolm X, one of the things I loved, reading his autobiography helped me lead me to Islam, because he was a lifelong learner. He was a voracious reader, and he could debate at Oxford because of this. And some of us, we only focus on the things about Black people. But if you ever listen to any of Malcolm X's old speeches, you know that he was well read across the board. And so my point is, yes, we should understand it, but we should understand it in a broader context, because I will stop now because I've gone on for far too long, because we Muslims, we have an obligation to our families, to the broader community, Muslim community, and to the world. African-American Muslims, two parts of that. One, you can't understand Islam in America without understanding the African-American experience. I agree with that. But secondly, that we need to lift our heads from focusing on the Black and understand that we have a responsibility to lead the entire world, just like the other Muslims do, and that we need to get busy about that rather than primarily focusing on our victimhood. I'll stop now.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I'm going to say two quick things. One is that from my perspective and my reading of history, and what I've been able to benefit from my exposure in the classroom and to faculty, is that really we're all part of the post-colonial struggle, right? All of our peoples were colonized in their own ways over a long period of time. And so that's the challenge. And the other thing is, I know Dr. Jones loves recommending books, which is one of the many things I appreciate about him. And I just want to mention, there's a fantastic contemporary scholar, Ibrahim Kendi X, who wrote the book Stamped, yes, which is one of his most famous works. And then his newest work is How to Be an Anti-Racist, which like grapples with this head on. So I would put those out there for anyone that wants to go to a deeper level.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes left. Roulla, you want to help us wrap up?
You know, one thing I'd say is that education is key to me, that we learn about one another's experiences and struggles, and we make sure as a community that we're not tokenizing certain leaders without really learning about their experiences. We just, we're in Black History Month. There's a lot of talk of our beloved brother Malcolm, Allah yarhamu, for example. And I wonder how many people that talk about him or others really know the history and learn about the experiences that those individuals had and the monumental ways that they impacted not just our country, but our community directly as well. And education to me is key. Education and having an intention about addressing these challenges. They're real, they're tough. It takes rolling up your sleeves and doing the hard work. It takes looking in the mirror sometimes and checking your own biases. We all have them. There's no sense in being defensive about it. There's, I think, more benefit to putting your time into and your energy into trying to address them and grow as a person, so that we as a community, hopefully, one by one, we then grow.
Yeah, we'll go 5 minutes over because we were 5 minutes late in starting. But the point here is that we need to understand that I've just sort of talked to African Americans about, don't start from being a victim. Let me just talk to some of my brothers who are recent immigrants, that they need to just be careful about presenting Islam. And I think this is something that both you, Roulla, and Omer talked about. Their Islam is the only Islam. That's number one. And secondly, that they are spokespeople for Islam in America, and they just got here 15 years ago or 10 years ago, if you know what I mean. And so, and they don't have a notion of Malcolm X or They don't know about Roots Kunta Kinte, you know, which was a cultural phenomenon. That was a Muslim family. I mean, was a cultural phenomenon in the United States of America. It hasn't all been doom and gloom for us, but this is why I think I call it African Heritage Black History Month is important, because there's so many things that I don't know about Black history. An example of which is the movie Hidden Figures, the book Hidden Figures. I'm just ashamed to say that I went to school near where those women mathematicians and one of them just died, one of the most famous of them. Those women mathematicians. I was right up the road from them, and I didn't know about them. I didn't know about them until the book was written and the movie came out. And so it's not just other people who need African Heritage Month or Black History Month, but it's us African Americans. All right, so we have a pushback here from somebody that says very problematic to equate the experience of Black Americans, and we'll make this our last one, and the several hundred years of enslavement and oppression to any sort of white or white violence per se in regards to the example of eugenics. In addition, as mentioned, the impact of colonization impacts the Eurocentric and colorism that plagues Islam here in the US. And in relation to the Sira, as mentioned here several times, we should and must without apology acknowledge the damage in Black communities, which is reflective of Black American experience within Islamic United States. This needs to be unpacked further, no question, but a thought. All right, so it's very I think why don't we just deal with the verse? Very problematic to equate the experience of Black Americans and several hundred years of enslavement and oppression to any sort of white on white violence per se. Just because you say that in order to understand the 1920s, that you have to understand the eugenics movement and the mentality. The eugenics movement lead to the Holocaust, right, in Europe, right? I mean, a lot of Black people don't know that, right? But I think you need, if you want to understand the dynamics of, quote, race in this country, you need to understand that. Is that equating Black enslavement with white on white violence? I don't know. That wasn't really my point. My point is that you don't understand this country if you only look at lynching of Black people during that time. Because this was, to me, this was an example of the 1% again, making sure that we fight one another. I think this notion of sort of competing oppressions holds us all back, because at the end of the day, we're all Bani Adam. And I'm not trying to say kumbaya, because I've been, I was raised in a segregated South. I hated it. I hate racism. And I lost a son to police violence. I hate what goes on in the street. But I can't deny the reality that what's happening in this country, some of it is not only happening to Black folks.
Dr. Jones, if I could add though, and fully agreeing with what you're saying, I have seen instances where people in the Muslim community who are not Black try to equate experiences. And I do think the point that there shouldn't be an equation, that there is something unique about the systemic and institutionalized racism that African Americans in the US have faced compared to other people. So when I'm in spaces and people talk and want to equate, I try to come at it with the energy of let's just listen to our brothers and sisters. We don't always have to respond and say, well, I had this experience too. It doesn't always have to be too. Sometimes it can be, you sit and you listen, you hear from the other person and what their history and what their experiences are.
But can it be both in this time to quit, but can it be both and this is what I mean by this. The reality is that there's something unique about the Holocaust. There's something unique about how women are treated in this society. And so one of the reasons that I understand how I can understand the Holocaust is through the lens of how I was treated for over 7 decades in this country. Do you follow me?
Yes.
And so this is not equating.
Right.
I mean, this is like how do we understand our collective experience in this country? And the Black experience was not a silo. It wasn't just happening to Black people. That doesn't make the oppression of Black people less. And in some ways, it makes it worse when you compare the two. But you need to understand the whole landscape, I think, if you're going to be a leader for humanity. If you want to be just a leader for Black people, okay.
No, this is thank you, Sister Roulla, for your comment. I really appreciated that idea of that. Goes back to what we talked about earlier, is that when you're in your own spaces, right, your own intra-community subspaces, is that those are the moments of courage to kind of to speak out and redraw people's attention. So one thing that I wanted to just mention, going back to the point before this question, was what I see as cultural chauvinism, right? To the thing that Dr. Jones named, is that you have recent immigrants that come here from other parts of the quote unquote Muslim world, and have come here and sort of comes and let me explain Islam to you, to the, for example, the Black American community. And I think what we need to do, and I'm saying as someone who's a child of immigrants, has grown up in sort of, in that third cultural space, is to say that's when, to Sister Roulla's point, is that's when we say, no, you need to sit down, you need to, to listen, you need to learn the history of the Muslim communities in this society, in this country. And there's nothing unique that gives you some sort of platform. And I just want to make one more comment, and to kind of connect it to something else, which is that, because I'm, again, privileged to work with young people, really dynamic, vibrant young people that always keep me on my toes. I'm going to talk about the issue, the climate crisis that we have right now, is that I was literally in a conversation this morning with some faculty administrators, and the point of it is that, with the way that human beings, the way that we operate, is that, you have like an example of a very powerful executive of some sort of company that sadly, is a manifestation of late stage capitalism that is in fact degrading the environment or contributing to that. But when their like 15-year-old high school student or 20-year-old college student child comes home and it says, you know what, I've really been thinking about that, father or mother, like, you work for this corporation, or you're part of a system that is aiding and abetting, right, in an active way, the destruction of the environment. And then they can actually lay out the way that it works. That's when people start paying attention. That's when they're like, oh, maybe I have a sort of a crisis of conscience moment that the kid's close to home. What I want to connect it to is that when we have second generation, third generation young Muslims that have immigrant heritage, that are in spaces, right, with their parents or their community, and they hear this kind of cultural chauvinism and this arrogance, to name it, to call it out, that comes out, that's when they can say, Baba, Ammu, that's not cool. You can't talk like that. You don't understand the history of those that came before us in these communities. And so that's what I would say. That's where I see where those are small moments, but they're also very large moments of moving the needle, inshallah.
Yeah, I'd like to begin to close out, and maybe the two of you might want to say last thing. The last thing I want to say is that when we talk about these issues, about the different people, I remember our beloved Prophet ﷺ, when he made hijrah from Mecca to Medina. One of the things he did, he predicted that the Muhajirin and the Ansar, he would have difficulty, right? They came from two different spaces, and this is not 2020 where people would know each other the way we know each other, relatively close together. And so he made them better than brothers. Some of you know this better than I. I thought this was brilliant because the Ansar would think that they were better because they took the Prophet in, when he was about to be impressed in Mecca. And the Muhajirin would think they were better because they started with him. And both had their values, you see? And so the reality is I think my plea to leadership, when you see this kind of thing happening, you should push people from different cultural backgrounds to work together, to work on a task together, to build the community together, and do it. And that's what I call affirmative action. And this is what I mean by using our beloved Prophet ﷺ as our moral exemplar. Closing remarks from the two of you. It's been an interesting conversation.
I would just say, I hope we can continue to have these types of conversations, that it's so critical to bring people together of diverse backgrounds, experiences, roles, and talk with one another, and to allow participation from people to share their input and this is the way, inshallah, in part, we're educating ourselves to begin to get past the challenges that we're facing as a community and as a country. And as I said earlier, I really think that the American Muslim community is in a unique position to be able to guide our country through some of the challenges that we have around race and race relations as they're identified kind of generally, and that we can really lead the pack in terms of bringing people together and working together for the better good.
Omer?
Beautifully said, mashallah. Mashallah. I echo every sentiment that Sister Roulla mentioned. Is that it's an honor and a pleasure to be invited into this conversation, and I definitely agree, Bismillah, that we need to continue this conversation.
So we're going to continue webinars. Our next webinar will be next month in March, in Women's History Month, where we'll be talking about women scholarship in Islam, inshallah. And so you'll be getting, those of you who are online, you'll be getting a message about that, about the time and who will be doing that. The other thing is that we'll be continuing this conversation on March 21st. We will take up this specific topic with the community. Those who've been to our Shura know that we have a large community meeting. This specific topic will be taken up and we'll talk about it, and then we'll send the feedback to everybody. So we will be continuing this conversation. This won't be the end of the conversation. Of course, if you take courses with us, cross-cultural counseling and communication, we'll be talking about some of these things. Before we close, we'd like to give a shout out to Asim and Ibrahim and Nasiha, who made sure that this whole thing crashed and kept me on point. And we'd like to ask Roulla to give us a closing dua.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina al-awwalin wal-akhirin. Ya Allah, we ask you to elevate truth and justice as only you can. We ask you to ease the suffering of so many in our country and around the world. Ya Allah, we ask you to protect and bring justice to those suffering injustice in our country and around the world. Ya Allah, we ask you to make us advocates for justice and guide us to continue these important conversations in our community and in our country. Ameen.
Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Jones. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.